Well, let me also add my welcome to you all to joining us here at the Everything Policy track at Mobile World Congress Americas. It's great to see you all back here again. We had a great day of discussion yesterday about spectrum, cybersecurity. We heard from leaders from across the federal government, from Congress, NTIA, and the FCC. And today we've got another exceptional lineup of speakers focused on, among other things, international spectrum, infrastructure siting, and what the future holds for converging markets. So it's my pleasure to introduce our first speaker of the day, FCC Commissioner Michael O'Rielly. Many of you know that Commissioner O'Rielly has dedicated himself to public service throughout his career. He spent many years as a key staffer on Capitol Hill, and he's a strong voice for the power of markets to deliver innovation for consumers, which is one of the hallmarks of the wireless industry. And Commissioner O'Rielly has been a thought leader on many of the issues that are most important to the wireless industry, including reallocating spectrum for commercial wireless use and ensuring that 911 professionals have access to the resources that they need. But maybe most importantly, he's also the proud father for the second time, having just welcomed a new baby girl into this world. So we're particularly grateful that he was willing to make the trip to Los Angeles to be with us. Please help me welcome FCC Commissioner Michael O'Rielly.
What a wonderful introduction. Gotta appreciate that. Thank you so very much. It is a distinct privilege to participate in the second Mobile World Congress, a partnership between CTIA and GSMA. Today's remarks replace the traditional game show approach of yesteryear, some of you remember that, with a down-in-the-weeds policy discussion. Therefore, I apologize in advance for those attending as you're stuck listening to me jabber on for about 15 minutes. As Scott just mentioned, I've spent the last 2 weeks with a new baby daughter and a mildly ill sister, so you can't realize how much I appreciate being here with you rather than home. I thank my wife for letting me go. If you don't see me out enjoying the LA tonight, you'll know that I'm enjoying a nice, quiet hotel room and taking advantage of that. The subject of our ensuing panel with great panelists is International Perspectives on Spectrum and 5G. Make no mistake, there is a global race to be the first nation to initially deploy 5G services. To do so, however, countries are going to need the right policies, and that naturally brings us to spectrum. Let me start by discussing how license structure and assignment methods provide the foundation for successful wireless policy, actual network deployment necessary to make 5G or any new technology a reality. These are complex issues that are frequently topics raised with my foreign colleagues. Oftentimes, governments are tempted to design spectrum policy to meet other goals, such as maximizing revenues, increasing competition, achieving ubiquitous service, and promoting technological innovation. In doing so, decision makers can be swayed to make unwise spectrum decisions. More specifically, my international counterparts sometimes contemplate shorter license terms with re-auction at the term's end, along with high opening bids to maximize funds for the treasuries and provide a continuing revenue source. They also look to adjust market sizes and implement technology dictates in an attempt to promote ubiquitous service, innovation, and network upgrades. Further, they consider spectrum set-asides and different auction structures to try to engineer competition. While perhaps well-intended, these conflicting goals, however, can have detrimental effects on the network built and services eventually offered. For example, spectrum set-asides and other approaches favoring certain participants, such as basing market sizes solely to help some participants while disadvantaging others, are unlikely to result in spectrum going to its best use and can delay or prohibit the provision of services. Re-auctioning spectrum at the end of a short license term will not lead to widespread deployments, network expansion, or unserved technology upgrades and innovation, which require vast expenditures and significant time to recoup costs. Mandating technologies for specific frequencies will keep a band frozen in time and also hinder future technology upgrades. And I can go on, but most importantly, many entities are unlikely to invest in needed spectrum under the wrong conditions, and the consumer will ultimately lose out in the end. I want to be clear that I raise these issues not to belittle or criticize my foreign counterparts, but instead to highlight the complexities of spectrum policy. It is far more complicated than Goldilocks jumping on a few beds and declaring, this one is just right. You can obviously see where my head is these days. The U.S. has established its leadership in wireless technologies, in large part by setting up simple, well-thought-out parameters and allowing the free market to do the rest. Generally, U.S. success, unlike those prior examples, has been grounded in policies designed to, 1, make spectrum attractive for all industry participants and uses, 2, put it to its highest valued use, and 3, ensure that the certainty exists to foster the necessary environment to promote investment and deployment. How do we do this? We start with our firmly grounded belief in flexible use, allowing those interested to choose the best use of the spectrum and the ability to evolve and upgrade networks and technologies as they see fit. Our license design doubles down on flexibility by utilizing geographic areas of sufficient size to enable a myriad of technologies and offerings, including fixed or mobile, private or commercial, foreseen or yet to be developed, with long terms, long enough, 10 years or more, to allow for actual deployments, including wide area networks and those dedicated to discrete areas, with renewability to facilitate the requisite network expenditures without fear of investment being stranded, with performance requirements as safeguards to ensure that licenses are put into use. The Commission then uses the ultimate free market mechanism to assign these licenses, simultaneous multi-round auctions. Ultimately, auction participants set spectrum values based on their business models, spectrum needs, and deployment plans. Further, price discovery permits entities to modify their strategies and refocus on some markets if others get too expensive. This ensures that spectrum will always go to its highest valued use. Providers will have the incentive to deploy the best and latest technology in order to compete in the marketplace and recoup their investments. And successful entities will be able to grow and use profits to expand and upgrade their services to meet the needs of Americans. And dare I say, it is a model worth replicating in other nations as well. Nations not only have different approaches to licensing and auction mechanisms, but these differences also extend to macro issues such as global harmonization and standard setting for various spectrum bands. So what does this mean for organizations that serve to bring nations together to discuss diverging views, develop rational spectrum policy, and prevent harmful outcomes? Here I speak not only of the International Telecommunication Union, the ITU for aficionados, but also the many standard-setting bodies such as 3GPP, IEEE, WinForum, and the TIEA standard-setting panels, as well as other more informal negotiations that occur almost every day amongst nations. To evaluate the functionality of these organizations, we should first stipulate to the premise that international spectrum harmonization is incredibly valuable. It just so happens that radio frequencies and waves do not adhere to artificial boundaries predetermined by past military conflicts or geographical markets. Instead, they're governed by science, and more specifically, by physics. There's actually no way to stop on a grand scale wireless signals from reaching their desired and natural endpoints. Moreover, we shouldn't wish to do so, as there are enormous benefits and efficiencies to be had if the entire ecosystem of equipment, manufacturers, service providers, application developers, and others can operate under a common understanding for one or more spectrum bands. Quite frankly, harmonization lowers the cost of production, deployment, and service offerings, meaning enormous advantages to consumers and nations. For years, we have relied on our international spectrum organizations to bring coherence, agreement, and forward thinking to many diverging spectrum approaches and views of the for the goal of producing global spectrum harmonization. But this structure, at both the formal and informal layers, is fraying, sufficiently becoming a major impediment for those nations like the United States that need sufficient spectrum allocation changes to reflect the dynamic wireless marketplace for commercial services. In the case of the ITU, it faces a bevy of real issues, which I've talked about a couple of times and expanded upon in a recent op-ed, from mission creep and bureaucratic overreach to basic ineffectiveness and blatant cronyism. Many of the changes are well known and needed, and yet little is being done to correct them. My fundamental concern with the ITU, however, is that leadership has not been prepared or willing to take the necessary steps to focus directly on spectrum issues and, when necessary, challenge those member nations trying to stop progress on spectrum policy. Nations that are leading the world in technological advances should demand more in terms of spectrum allocations to prepare for future wireless services in the 1, 5, 10, and 20-year timeframes. It is unacceptable to allow specific nations or regions to block spectrum progress when it's done not to preserve national security or prevent harmful interference, but to further the parochial goals of the objectors, like protecting the financial balance sheets of domestic incumbents or enabling a nation's companies to compete or even dominate internationally. For the private sector, standard-setting bodies, we have seen attempts by nations to try to influence and skew the elected leadership to favor certain businesses' interests at the expense of nations like the United States. This shameful practice undermines legitimacy of new standards and, if successful, could deter companies from participating and cooperating in the process. In the end, if the decisions of standard-setting bodies face questions of legitimacy and undue influence, then companies will simply walk away, which will further fracture the quest for greater spectrum harmonization. This reminds me of a pertinent quote by former Senator and Department of Defense Secretary Chuck Hagel, in which he said in relations to foreign policy, "Alliances and international organizations should be understood as opportunities for leadership and a means to expand our influence, not constraints on our power." Senator Hagel was correct, pointing out that the U.S. and other nations join international organizations for purposes of leading and influencing like-minded countries. But it should never be seen as an attempt to diminish our role or sovereignty, and it doesn't limit our ability to take actions we may need to advance our own goals. Similarly, it should be accepted that the United States and its private sector companies expect the global spectrum policy forums will be used to reach proper and mutually beneficial outcomes. Any effort to use these processes as a direct assault on our nation or our companies will not be allowed to stand. We have options. There are a handful of nations that are quite clearly leading global wireless advancements, and real capabilities are available to work outside the ITU or the existing standard-setting bodies to further spectrum policy. It should never come to this, but preventing such a reality will require a direct involvement and improvement in the structural performance of international spectrum organizations and a check on bad practices. And that gets me to my last point. And while I have this captive audience, I think it's worth raising whether the apparatuses of setting spectrum policy can or should be used for ulterior motives. In other words, what happens when other governments, especially those built on far different models than the United States, use spectrum policy bodies to advance their individual or collective geopolitical interests, sometimes at the expense of spectrum policy? What happens if such participation and coordination is not done to drive sound spectrum policy, but to facilitate state-sponsored industrial policy in other fields? What happens if elected leadership positions are used as pedestals to stymie the political and economic interests of the United States? It should come as no surprise that I'm a firm believer and defender of the structure of the United States government, which consists of a representative democracy with foundations and reliance on individual liberty and a free capitalist marketplace. Sadly, my views are not universally held, as several nations actively engaged in spectrum policy have government systems based on derivatives of the intellectually broken and historically failed communist state. I plan to have more to say on this in the coming months, but I think the answers to these questions matter for future spectrum policy. With that, I've taken too much time already. I see the clock is already in the back blinking on me. I think it's best to depart and let our spectrum experts on the following panel take it from here. So I want to thank you so very much for your hospitality and comedy, and I wish you best for the rest of the conference and Congress. Thank you so very much.
Thank you, Commissioner O'Rielly. Did you want to take any questions?
Well, I'm happy too. They just came out of nowhere, so it just threw me off a little bit. No, there we go. No, let's get to our panel. I'm happy to answer any questions on the side if anyone would like. Let's get to the great panel. Thank you so very much, everyone.